All right, let's dive into this Fall City Family Massacre case. It's been all over the news, and I know a lot of you out there want to try and figure out what happened, like what went wrong with this seemingly perfect family in this like nice Washington neighborhood. We're going to be breaking down a pretty recent YouTube documentary that really digs into this whole story.
Yeah, it's really crazy how fast this picture perfect image of this Humiston family just fell apart. On the surface, they seem to have everything, you know? Big family, the dad, Mark was an engineer, so they had money, beautiful home in this neighborhood called Lake Alice. People were describing them as like the dream family. And then on October 21st, 2024, everything changed.
Yeah, you're right. It's like you said, picture perfect. It's kind of like Shakespearean in a way, right?
Yeah.
This perfect image, and then bam, this horrible violence. It all starts with these two 911 calls. First, you have a neighbor, Bradley Dennis. He calls, he's totally panicked. He tells the operator that one of the Humiston kids, 11-year-old BH, had just shown up at his door with gunshot wounds, saying her whole family had been shot.
And then just a few minutes before that, there's another call that comes in. This time it's 15-year-old Drew Humiston, one of the sons. He's saying that his brother, Benjamin, just went on this shooting rampage, killed their whole family, and then shot himself. So right from the beginning, you have these two totally different stories, two really urgent calls that are painting these totally different pictures of what happened that morning.
Yeah, it's like a true crime puzzle. We're starting off with two completely different pieces. But before we even try and put these pieces together, let's just step back for a second and try to get to know this Humiston family a little better. So we have Mark and Sarah Humiston, the parents, and their 5 kids. Drew, the one who made the 911 call. Benjamin, who Drew says is the shooter. And then the 3 younger ones, Joshua, Catherine, and BH, who we just talked about. They lived in this, we talked about how affluent this neighborhood is. It's known for this beautiful lake. And it's supposed to be a real close community.
And that makes it even more shocking, doesn't it? This family that seemed to be living the American dream. And then just like that, they're ripped apart. It really shows how looks can be deceiving.
Absolutely. So BH's escape. It's seriously like something out of a horror movie. She wakes up to the sound of gunshots and people screaming. Can you imagine how scary that would be? She looks out of her room, and she sees her dad, Mark, and her 9-year-old brother, Joshua. They're both lying in the hallway, shot. And then she actually sees her 7-year-old sister, Catherine, get shot too.
Yeah, and then she's confronted by her brother, Drew, who shoots her in the hand and neck. So to survive, she plays dead. I mean, think about that for a second. How much presence of mind did that take? She saw these horrific things happen and then still managed to escape and run to the neighbor's house for help. It's truly amazing how brave and resilient she was given what she went through.
It's really chilling. So let's go back to that other 911 call, the one that Drew made. He says he was hiding in the bathroom when his brother Benjamin just started shooting. Killed the whole family. And then killed himself. Drew even tries to give a possible reason for it. He says that Benjamin had gotten caught looking at pornography and was going to get in trouble for it.
But here's where things get really interesting. When you compare what Drew's saying to what BH actually went through, there are some pretty big inconsistencies. Like, Drew claims he was hiding in the bathroom the whole time, but BH actually saw him, like, shooting people.
And when the police get to the crime scene, they start to see even more problems with Drew's story. Right by the front door, they find an empty gun lockbox and holster. Remember how BH said that Drew was the only one who knew the combination to that lockbox?
And the inconsistencies just keep piling up. The way the bodies are positioned, where they found the shell casings. There are signs of forced entry into the master bathroom, where they found Sarah, the mom. All of this stuff just doesn't match up with Drew's original story about it just being a simple murder-suicide.
So let's walk through the crime scene a little bit. Downstairs, in the hallway, they find Joshua, Mark, and Catherine. They had all been shot. There's blood and shell casings everywhere. And then at the end of the hallway, they find Benjamin. He has a gun in his hand. But here's the weird part. There's no blood spatter on the gun, which is pretty unusual if he shot himself.
Yeah, that lack of blood spatter is a big deal. It suggests that he didn't shoot that gun at close range, which doesn't really make sense if he shot himself. And then you add in that forced entry into the master bathroom. Like, there was a struggle in there that just doesn't fit with Drew's story.
So yeah, the crime scene is definitely raising some serious red flags. And then the autopsy results come back, and things get even more complicated.
Right, the autopsies tell us a lot, especially when you look at all the different gunshot wounds and how far away they were shot from. Some were from close up, some were from further away. That just doesn't make sense if Benjamin was the only one shooting.
Okay, so let's go through the autopsy findings one by one. So Mark, the dad, He'd been shot 4 times,
Hmm.
including once in the back of the head, which killed him. Joshua and Catherine were both shot in the head, too. And Sarah had been shot behind her ear. And then once in the eyebrow, which was the fatal shot.
And remember Benjamin, the one they found with the gun? He had 2 gunshot wounds, one on his cheek that seemed like it was from a distance, and then one behind his ear that was from close up. So when you combine that with the fact that there was no blood spatter on his gun, it really makes you think that he maybe wasn't the only one shooting.
Yeah, it's like every time we find a new piece of this puzzle, it just gets more and more confusing.
Exactly. If we take a step back and just look at all the evidence so far, those 911 calls that don't match up, what BH said happened, all the stuff at the crime scene, the autopsies, it's starting to look like Drew's story might be a lie. It seems like the evidence is telling a completely different story. And that just leads to even more questions. What actually happened that night in the Humiston house?
Yeah. And then there's the aftermath of all this. BH thankfully survives, but obviously she's dealing with both the physical and the emotional scars of what happened.
It's just unimaginable what she went through. It's going to take a lot of support and resources for her to recover from this. And we'll talk more about that later.
Right. We'll definitely be discussing that more. But in the meantime, Drew is arrested and charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. And the prosecutors want to try him as an adult, which could mean a sentence of 25 years to life.
Trying a 15-year-old as an adult is a really complicated issue. The court's going to have to consider a lot of different things. How bad the crime was, how mature Drew is, what his chances of rehabilitation are, and the fact that he's never committed a crime before.
So we end up with this big question. Will he be tried as an adult? And if he is, will he end up spending most of his life in prison? Or will they keep the case in juvenile court and try to help him rehabilitate?
And as we keep going with this deep dive, we'll look at possible motives, the whole legal battle that's coming up, and how this tragedy has affected the community.
This case is far from over. And we'll be back in part 2 to keep unpacking it.
As we dig deeper into this whole thing, I think the biggest question is what would make a seemingly normal teenager do something so horrific? What was going on behind the scenes in this perfect family?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? The documentary doesn't really give us like a clear psychological profile of Drew, but it does kind of hint at a few things that might have been going on.
Yeah.
One thing that really stuck out to me was all the pressure Drew might have been feeling at school. BH mentioned that he was failing some classes and might have been in trouble with his parents because of it.
Oh, yeah. That makes you wonder, what kind of pressure were these kids under, especially in a community like that, where there's so much focus on achievement and success?
Exactly. And then there's that part in Drew's 911 call where he brings up Benjamin getting in trouble for looking at pornography.
Yeah.
You made me wonder if, maybe that was Drew projecting his own anxieties. Maybe he was dealing with similar stuff and he was scared of what would happen if his parents found out.
That's a really interesting thought. It's pretty common for people, especially teenagers, to project their own anxieties or guilt onto other people. It can be a way of avoiding blame or dealing with things they don't want to face themselves.
Right, and teenagers, especially in these high-achieving environments.
Right.
They can feel so much pressure to succeed. Like the documentary talked about how financially stable the family was and how nice their neighborhood was. So you have to imagine there were pretty high expectations for the kids.
For sure. All that societal pressure plus whatever was going on in the family, it can create this breeding ground for anxiety and resentment. And sometimes those feelings, they can come out in really unexpected and destructive ways.
Right. It's like a pressure cooker. And in some cases, it can just explode. Another thing the documentary mentioned was the possibility of some underlying resentment between the siblings. We don't really know a lot about the relationships between the Humiston kids, but it's not crazy to think there might have been some competition or jealousy going on.
Yeah, sibling rivalry is normal. But like you said, sometimes it can get out of hand, especially if you throw in things like mental health issues or external pressures. Even small arguments can become really serious.
And of course, we can't ignore the fact that there was a gun in the house. Even if it was locked up, that easy access definitely played a part in this whole thing.
Yeah, it's so sad. But the availability of guns is something we see over and over again in cases like this. It's a reminder that we need to be responsible gun owners, keep guns locked up safely, and talk openly about mental health, especially in families with kids.
To me, the documentary doesn't really give us a clear answer about why Drew did what he did. And honestly, we may never really know. But talking about all these different factors, it helps us understand just how complicated this situation was.
Yeah, it's important not to jump to conclusions. Hopefully the trial will give us more information about what happened and help answer some of these questions, but we have to remember that Drew is innocent until proven guilty.
Absolutely. I'm really curious to see how this trial plays out. Will there be enough evidence to try Drew as an adult? What will BH say when she testifies?
It's definitely going to be a tough trial. A lot of emotional testimony, a lot of tough questions. The prosecution's going to have to be really careful with their case. They'll have to present all the forensic evidence, what BH said happened, maybe even get some expert opinions. And the defense, they'll probably try to make Drew seem more human, point out how young he is, the fact that he's never been in trouble before, and try to find any reasons that might explain what he did.
I wonder how the defense is going to deal with the fact that Drew originally said his brother did it, especially with all the evidence pointing in a different direction.
Exactly. They're going to have to explain all those inconsistencies and come up with a story that makes sense, but still keeps Drew innocent. I think BH's testimony is going to be really important here. She's the only one who was there who can say for sure that Drew's original story isn't true.
Yeah, what she says about that night, it could be huge for both prosecution and the defense. It might give us some insight into Drew's state of mind and what happened leading up to the shooting.
But on the other hand, because of everything she went through, the defense is going to try and find holes in her story. It's a really delicate balance, trying to get justice, but also making sure Drew gets a fair trial.
It's a lot to handle, especially for someone so young who's already been through so much. It makes you think about the support she's getting, to help her cope with the trauma and deal with the legal stuff.
That's a good point. And unfortunately, the documentary doesn't really talk about what kind of support BH is getting. Ideally, she would have access to therapy that's specifically designed for trauma, maybe support groups for people who've been through violence, and other resources in the community to help her process what happened and start to heal.
Yeah, it reminds us that justice isn't just about punishing someone. It's also about helping the victims, giving them what they need to rebuild their lives, and finding a way to heal.
Exactly. Real justice means holding the person accountable, but it also means having compassion for the victims and supporting them. It's about understanding how long-lasting the impact of these events can be and trying to offer some hope.
What about the community? How have they reacted to all of this, and how has it affected their sense of safety and well-being?
The documentary talks about how shocked and disbelieving everyone was. I mean, remember, the Humistons were seen as this model family, living in this perfect neighborhood. This whole thing completely shattered their sense of safety, and it's definitely left a scar.
Yeah, I can only imagine. All that fear and anxiety. Suddenly, the worst possible thing happened right in their own neighborhood. It must have been terrifying.
It really shows how these tragedies have a ripple effect. They don't just affect the people who were directly involved. They send shockwaves through the whole community and leave everyone feeling vulnerable and uneasy.
From your experience, how do communities usually deal with this kind of thing? What can they do to rebuild trust and start healing?
It's a long and hard process, but there are things that can help. Open communication, having conversations as a community, holding vigils and memorials. These things can create a space for people to grieve together and support each other.
Right. It's about coming together, acknowledging the pain, and finding a way to move forward as a community.
Exactly. It's about rebuilding that sense of community and reminding each other that even after something like this happens, there's strength in being united.
This case really highlights how important community support and resources are, not just for the victims, but for everyone who's been affected by this horrible event.
Absolutely. It reminds us that we're all connected and that we need to work together to heal from trauma.
So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we're left with a lot to think about. The legal case, trying to figure out why this happened, the trauma that BH has gone through, and how this has impacted the whole community.
And in the final part of our discussion, we'll talk about what could happen in the trial, the ethical questions around trying a minor as an adult, and what this case means for society as a whole.
We'll also talk about what we can do to prevent things like this from happening again, and what steps we can take to address the root causes of these tragedies.
Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll try to put all the pieces of the Fall City Family Massacre together and figure out what we can learn from this heartbreaking case.
Okay, so we've gone through a lot with this Fall City Family Massacre. The different stories, the evidence, possible reasons why this might have happened, and how it's affected everyone involved. And now it's time to see what happens in court.
Yeah, this trial, it's going to be a tough one. There are a lot of emotions involved, and it's going to be complicated. One of the biggest things they have to figure out is whether to try Drew Humiston as an adult or not. He's only 15, but the prosecution wants to try him as an adult. which could mean a way harsher sentence.
Right, we talked about that earlier.
Yeah.
But can you kind of break down how they make that decision? What are the things the court looks at when they're deciding if someone so young should be tried as an adult?
It's a big decision with huge consequences. The court's going to look at a bunch of different things. The biggest one is how serious the crime was. We're talking about 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. So that's a major factor.
And I'm guessing Drew's age and maturity are going to be important too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They'll look at his psychological development, if he understands the consequences of what he did, and if he can be rehabilitated. They'll also see if he's ever committed any other crimes, which, in Drew's case, he hasn't.
Right, the documentary said he'd never been in trouble with the law before. He did extracurriculars. He seemed like a pretty average teenager.
And the defense will definitely use that in their argument. They'll talk about how young he is, that he's never been in trouble before, and they'll try to paint a picture of him as this young guy who made a terrible mistake, maybe because of too much pressure or some mental health issue he didn't know about.
So what if they decide to keep the case in juvenile court? What happens then?
If it stays in juvenile court, they focus more on rehabilitation than punishment. The goal is to figure out why he committed the crime in the first place and give him the support and resources he needs to become a productive member of society.
So the outcome could be really different. An adult trial could mean he goes to prison for a really long time. But juvenile court is more about helping him get better and rejoin society.
It's a really tricky situation. When you have minors who commit serious crimes, you have to find a balance between holding them accountable and remembering that they're still young, their brains are still developing, and they have a better chance of changing and being rehabilitated.
It's a tough line to walk. Now, what about BH? She's the only one who can say for sure that Drew's story about his brother doing it isn't true. What she says in court could be really important.
Yeah, what she says about that night. It's going to be powerful, but also really sad. The jury's going to hear firsthand what she saw, how scared she was, and all the trauma she's dealing with. Her words could be what helps everyone understand what really happened.
But it's got to be so hard for her. She's just a kid, and she's already been through something unimaginable to have to go to court and relive it all.
Yeah, it's going to be really tough for her emotionally. And the defense is going to question everything she says, looking for any mistakes or weaknesses in her story. So it's super important that she has the right support and guidance through this whole thing.
It's like they have to find a way to get justice. Make sure Drew has a fair trial. And take care of BH, who's already been through so much.
Exactly. This trial is going to push the limits of our legal system, and it's going to force us to ask some hard questions about who's responsible, how we rehabilitate people, and just how complex human behavior can be.
This case is a real reminder of how fragile life is, and how important it is to talk about things like mental health, how families work, and responsible gun ownership. We can't change what's happened, but we can try to make things safer for our kids in the future.
You're absolutely right. This case has implications that go way beyond just this family. It makes us look at our values as a society, our legal system, and our responsibility to protect those who are vulnerable.
This deep dive into the Fall City Family Massacre has been a heavy one. We've gone through some dark and complicated stuff, but it's also a wake-up call. We need to be aware of what's going on around us, support those who are hurting, and fight for change.
Keep following this case as it goes to trial and talk about the issues it brings up, because if we want to prevent things like this from happening again, we need to understand these complicated problems.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been tough, but it's important. We hope you learned something from it. And remember, even when things are bad, there's always hope for healing, for justice, and for a better future.